Hi, good evening, Jinzhao. Good evening, Dr. Lu.
Hi, Dr. Lu Hong.
Hello, hi.
Yes, seeing you after a whole month. Okay, it's just 8 o'clock. Shall we just start?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, great. I'll do a very brief introduction and then we'll pass on to Janet. Okay, let's welcome our audience for tonight. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mandarin Wine Club webinars, which are co-hosted by Cambridge China Centre, the Confucius Institute for Business London, Wine Peak, and CEPD, fortnightly on Sundays with our wine webinar speaker Jenny Wang, author of the Chinese Wine Renaissance. I'm Jinzhao Li, Director of Cambridge China Centre. It's been just over a month since our last wine webinar before Christmas. Hope everybody has had a very nice Christmas and New Year break and has been keeping very well. And the webinar today is on speculation and investment in wine, a very interesting topic. I'm very happy to see so many old friends and new friends joining us today. And the audience are muted at the moment. We'll activate everybody's audio and video at the second part of the webinar so we can carry on drinking and chatting. Now let's welcome Jenny Wang and hope you enjoy the next hour or so. Janet.
Thank you, Jinzhao. Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year, first of all. And it's great that we are continuing this webinar series into the new year. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we might be stuck here for a while. So we've got a new program for 2021 now, up till April. So today I thought, maybe some of you are still trying to do dry January, possibly. So maybe we'll start with a sort of slightly somber subject, which is investment and speculation. But nevertheless, it's still a very interesting topic, I think. And so I hope you will enjoy this session as well. I'm definitely not doing dry January. So for those of you who have the wines, so this is our new case, 6 wines from China but also England, because I thought post-Brexit, let's do a slightly tongue-in-cheek out of Europe case. So we've got 4 Chinese wines and 2 English wines. And you will see in the later sessions, we'll look at England as well as China as 2 of the very interesting and exciting new wine regions, and we'll do some comparisons, looking at the differences, the similar challenges, but also how they differ. So that's the case we've got right now on offer via the Cambridge China Centre. And today, for those of you who are joining me and not doing dry January, we're drinking the Martin Winery Cabernet Grenache today. This is an interesting winery. I thought I'll start with this one because Martin Winery started off as a Sino-British collaboration. So the vineyard was founded in 1997 after Sir Ted Heath, the former British Prime Minister, following his visit to China, to Hebei province. And it was he who suggested that maybe this area could develop a wine industry. And therefore, Martin Winery was really inspired by Ted Heath. And it started off having a British investor as well. And Cabernet Grenache, you may remember from some of our sessions last year, I did mention Cabernet Grenache is, for a long time, people were wondering what exactly was this variety. It seems to be a very unique name, only used in China. And it turned out that Cabernet Grenache is actually Carmenère. But in recent years, some vineyards in China have also found Cabernet Franc, which were also labeled as Cabernet Grenache. So now it seems that in China, most of the Cabernet Grenache are, in fact, Carmenère. but some of them are Cabernet Franc. And the reason was Carmener and Cabernet Franc were both Bordeaux varieties. So in 1896, when the first industrial winery was founded in China, mixed Cabernet were brought to China from Bordeaux to experiment and see which variety would work well in China. So Cabernet Gemischt was a misspelling of the German word gemischt, so mixed Cabernet, right? So that name just stuck in Chinese, that we still call Carmener or occasionally Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Gemischt, right? So that's the origin of this variety. So we can talk about the wine later in the group discussion when we finish our main session. So I'll put the wine aside for now, and we can drink it together later. So today, on to the main topic, which is speculation, 投机, and investment, 投资, right? So 机 is opportunistic, right? So 投机 is grabbing an opportunistic moment to have a punt, right, in the market, whereas 投资 is very much maybe with a more planned out horizon and strategies, right? So in wine, there are, as you shall see later, through some stories I want to share specifically related to China, that we can see the differences in a speculative buying and selling of wine versus a more strategy-based investment process. So I'm sure if we talk about investment or wine prices, etc., we all know that Chinese people love Lafite, right? So Lafite is often cited as the most recognized wine brand in China, and the most sought after and most counterfeited wine in China as a result of its success. But today I want to first of all share with you the story why Lafite attained its legendary status in China. And it's not really actually the taste of Lafite, because fine wines, as you may know, Bordeaux have 5 first growth properties. And then, of course, in the world of wine, there are fine wines from other regions like Burgundy as well. But why did Lafite first attain its sort of notorious status? So let's start with that story. So Lafite 传奇, so the legend of Lafite. And to start with that story, we have to talk about Robert Parker, who is a very influential wine critic. He's American. And his prediction, I suppose, his call on the vintage 1982 in Bordeaux, right? So 1982 was a vintage that Robert Parker made very famous because at the time, some of the mainstream critics did not necessarily give 1982 that great a verdict, whereas Robert Parker was convinced that 1982 would turn out to be one of the finest, greatest vintages, modern vintages of Bordeaux. And it turned out that he was right. And 1982 became one of the most legendary vintages from Bordeaux since pretty much 1961, right? And 1982 was the vintage that many people consider to have heralded in the modern style, the great modern style of Bordeaux. Right, so Robert Parker essentially made his name famous by calling 1982 as sort of the vintage of the century, essentially. And he also formulated a 100-point scoring system for wine. So consumers can very easily get a sense of a wine's quality by simply referring to his scoring system. So, you probably have heard of Parker scores out of 100. If a wine is a 99-point Parker wine or a 100-point Parker wine. And it transpired that Parker became very influential and had a lot of sway in terms of wine prices based on his scores. So he became a very important figure in the world of wine. And also his scores have very direct implications to wine prices as well. So we must mention Robert Parker. And Bordeaux, so Bordeaux 1982 was what made him famous. And he has subsequently retasted and reaffirmed the quality of 1982. So this is a chart I've taken out from my book, which shows you the upward trend of the 1982 vintage, right? So when it was first released to its incredible height reached in 2010, as you can see from this price chart. And this was what initially captured the imagination of the Chinese punters, really, right? So around the year 2000, some Chinese investors started to get interested in Bordeaux. And this is sort of the narrative that they were being told sort of between 2000 and 2008. They've seen a fairly rapid rise, the fairly steep portion of that chart, between 2000 and 2008 was what caught the Chinese buyers' imagination. So this is just a little passage from my book that the 1982 vintage was really branded as the trade of the decade. If you bought in year 2000, you would have yielded over 1,000% profit in 10 years, right? So that's the narrative being told to a lot of Chinese buyers who just started to get interested in Bordeaux. But of course, many of them have actually missed this trade, right? So if you imagine someone hearing the story in 2008, they've essentially kind of missed the bulk of this move up, right? So what caught their eye next was the vintage 2008, right? So suddenly it seems that another opportunity was about to present itself in front of these set of new Chinese investors, right? So what was interesting about 2008, I'm sure you all remember, was that we were in the midst of a global credit crunch, right? There was the financial market was actually in turmoil. So initially, when Lafite first released their 2008 vintage, they were very cautious with the pricing because the global economic outlook was very gloomy, right? So they released the 2008 at a 30% discount actually to the 2007 vintage, right? So it started quite modestly. And this makes sense because generally what determines release prices are based around market condition, right? The macro economic condition, customers' likely appetite at the time for fine wines, and also comparators like 2007, 2005, or even older vintages, because you want to maintain sort of a relative value, to what you've released previously. And also with wine, as you know, there's a drinking window as well. So some older vintages will start to come into the drinking window. So people will look at what sort of prices those wines which are ready to drink are being sold at, and that's also a price comparator that you should bear in mind as well. So the campaign started fairly cautiously, or based on fairly fundamental price drivers, right? But then the next thing that happened was pretty much straight after the initial release price, Robert Parker gave the vintage a 99 to 100 point, which was a higher score than many people anticipated. So being a very influential wine critic, he his scoring had an immediate impact on the pricing. So when he released the score, Lafite appreciated to £9,000 from, I think, 2,000 previously, right? So that was a huge jump in price, just based on critic score. So that's very interesting. So between April to October, the price have appreciated quite remarkably. And then what was very, very interesting, if you notice on the right-hand side of the bottle, you might have noticed a little difference to the bottle. So Lafite then announced to commemorate this special vintage 2008 for two reasons. One is that they recognize that Asia is becoming an interesting market. And 8 is considered the lucky number. So 2008 seems to be a lucky vintage that's likely to appeal to Asian and Chinese customers. And secondly, Lafite in 2008 started their Chinese vineyard project in Shandong province, which we mentioned last year in our last season. So 2008 was also a special year for Lafite for going into China to plant vines and make wines in China. So to commemorate this special vintage, they decided to etch the bottle with the number 8. Right. So when this news broke out, literally, all the brokers in London, all the merchants in London sold out straight away overnight. And the price just shot up. Right. And the phones were off the hooks and many people were inquiring and wanting to buy it. But it was sold out completely, very quickly. So this last price move, you kind of want to slightly raise your eyebrow. Well, in hindsight, we probably would, right? To say, does this really justify such a price move to beyond £11,000 a case, right? So this is where we have to be quite cautious because we're getting into more speculative behavior. And of course, in hindsight, it's very easy, but I'm sure you can imagine what happened next. So this happened to the price. Very quickly, the vintage, the price of the 2008 vintage collapsed. And in fact, this is not just for Lafite, actually. It was across the board. Bordeaux wines seems to have priced fairly high since the legendary 2008 vintage. So in the subsequent vintages, 2009 and 2010, the prices were all released very, very high compared to previous years because the wineries see a huge potential in Chinese interest, and they started to price in future price appreciation at the time of release, right? So prices were released quite high, but then that was not sustainable. By 2011, that price rise have run out of steam, and there was a massive correction, fairly steep correction. But then some optimists thought, maybe, it's quite short-lived. It's just a latest correction of the last leg up. We should see the market recovering fairly soon after that. But quite unfortunately, there were several macro factors at play at that time. First of all, the global economic situation have not completely improved, right? So, it was still very sluggish, especially the traditional markets in Europe. They're still reeling and not really seeing very good signs of recovery. But what's more important was China actually started to introduce this anti-corruption policy, right? So in 2002 and 2013, that policy was reinforced rather than relaxed, right? As many people have speculated, right? So this anti-corruption drive was very deep and prolonged, even to this day, right? So the price suffered further declines, and it just didn't really recover for a long, long time. So this graph is from the period of the height of 2011 all the way to 2016. So in all the subsequent vintages and years, Bordeaux prices went through a quite a long period of correction and sluggishness. So we only saw signs of, fairly strong signs of recovery post 2016. And over the last 4 or 5 years, prices in Bordeaux have started to recover and strengthen again, right? So we'll talk about that in a bit later. So it's not just Lafite, right? So as I was saying, the Bordeaux first growths, or Bordeaux in general, they had a similar story to tell, with a rapid rise in prices all the way from, especially from 2008 to 2010 and 11, peaking at 2011, and then plummeting rather aggressively, and then seeing several years of correction and sluggishness, and then since 2016, it's recovering again. So this, I want to also mention to you LiveX. LiveX is an exchange, is a fine wine exchange used by the trade as the benchmark. So their indices, especially this one, LiveX Fine Wine 100, is the industry standard to track the most sought after wines on the exchange as a benchmark for what's going on in the fine wine market. So 2016 till now, I suppose the economy is entering into a new phase where we're seeing increasingly lower. We're entering into a lower real interest rate environment, and therefore physical assets have started to overperform again. So a lot of people are starting to look at alternative and physical assets. And that is one of the reasons why wine is starting to show convincing signs of recovery, right? So, and this, in my opinion, could continue as well, because, we are still going to see a similar situation with very low interest rate, and a flight to physical assets is probably still going to be a longer term trend, right? So 2016 onwards, and also during the pandemic period, we've seen strong performance in the fine wine sector. So I think this is a convincing strengthening trend post the more speculative activity driven rise in the 2008 to 2011 period. So we talk about the Lafite cautionary tale, but actually, that's sort of speculating on a single name, right? But you could have done very well if you bought something else, which is Mouton Rothschild 2000, vintage 2000. So that has weathered through the 2011 price correction, has continuously performed very strongly since 2000. And this is sort of, I want to use this as an example to show you what the drivers, what are the speculative drivers, and what are the more fundamental drivers. So for example, with Chateau Mouton, although this is also a commemorative bottle, to commemorate the new millennium, year 2000. But the wine itself, first of all, is a first growth as well. It had a good critical score, and is from a vintage that was fairly well acclaimed, right? And the pricing has been fairly steady. the growth is not too steep at any point, but it's been very steady on an upward trend pretty much all the way since its first release, right? So so it is definitely possible to pick the right trade, and not to follow the bandwagon of, for example, just because the bottle is decorated with a new symbol, suddenly it deserves a huge, rapid rising price. So that doesn't really hold, right? But a bottle such as the 2000 Mouton, with the passing years, for one reason, the wine is becoming more mature and becoming more drinkable, right? Therefore, the value is intrinsic value is rising. And secondly, with wine, the good thing is that it's a limited amount of production per vintage, right? So it's always a diminishing supply, right? So over the last 20 years, the quantity of Mouton Rothschild vintage 2000 is obviously declining, and therefore you have this decline in supply and the rise in its intrinsic value due to its coming into maturity. Therefore, the price would naturally go up on the supply side. And on the demand side, you can argue that over the past 20 years, we've seen a more global base of wine demand and fine wine investing, not just from the traditional markets, but now also much more interestingly, the rise of the Chinese demand for fine wines as well, right? So the demand has gone up while the supply has gone down, right? So that is usually the premise to argue that fine wines are worth investing in the long run. You can see this is over quite a long period. We're talking about a 20-year horizon where you're seeing this this very substantial return on your investment. So the other thing we should talk about is what happened when Bordeaux corrected. It gave opportunity to another region. So the Chinese were very quick to notice Burgundy as an alternative wine region to investing. And as you can see here, the red line being Bordeaux and the blue line being Burgundy. And at the year 2011, there's a clear divergence where Burgundy have shot up, right? Whereas Bordeaux is sort of struggling on for a long, long time, right? And I'm sure you know the iconic trophy wine from Burgundy being the Romani Conti. So forget the taste. We can argue is Romani definitely much better than Lafite, but the sheer fact is that only for around 450 cases of Romani Conti is made a year versus around 20,000 cases made by Lafite, right? So from the outset, you have a much, much, much smaller supply, with the DRC, right, versus Lafite, right? So, and that's something that investors have caught on to, which is Burgundy, especially at the trophy wine level. Their supply, their production size are very, very, very small, right? So, therefore, the scarcity value essentially drove up the price of Burgundy in the under the spotlight of now a global, especially demand from China, right? So suddenly the demand have become globalized, whereas the supply of Burgundies have always been very, very limited. And that is the main reason why Burgundy in recent years have seen this incredible growth, right? So to some extent, this is really the China effect, right? So suddenly the fine wine world has discovered huge appetite from China. So the Chinese market have sort of learned its lesson from the speculative bubble of Bordeaux back in the 2010 to 2011 period. But that hasn't completely dampened appetite from China. And in fact, most people in the wine trade do believe this demand from China will only increase into the future. As more people become wealthy, they will want to drink fine wines. They will want to invest in fine wines. And this is not just a China story. You can argue that this is the emerging market story. People from maybe in the future from India, from Brazil, they will also start to demand more fine wine investment. So the global demand for wine should be quite bullish, whereas the supply side is either limited or it's not going to grow at the same sort of pace as the demand. But certainly for the time being, the China effect is the most prominent and the most important for the wine trade, and also for us as investors, because for us, we need to sometimes know when is this driven by fundamental drivers and when is it because lots of Chinese people are speculating, right? But you don't want to be the last person holding something that you actually didn't really want. You were just in it to make a quick buck. You don't want to be the last person holding onto that position, right? So for us, we need to be able to identify when something is starting to look overheated and speculative, especially the reason why a wine's price is going up. So this is important. And just as an interesting story, we were talking about earlier, the story was Lafite 2008, but this is something that just happened last month, right? So Mouton Rothschild for vintage 2018 have commissioned a Chinese artist to create its label. As you may know, Mouton Rothschild every year have a different label, which is designed by a different artist, right? So for 2018, Xu Bing created this creative calligraphy piece for Mouton Rothschild. So this was announced in December 2020, so literally a month ago. And on the back of this news, the price of Mouton Rothschild went up by 12%. So, this sort of thing will keep on happening, right? But in a way, 2018, you can argue Mouton Rothschild 2018 is a well-regarded wine. It's a first growth, and potentially the price may well end up much higher in the future, in 10, 20 years' time. But then you've got to make the judgment call, whether this 12% increase in price is justifiable, right? What is the story here? Do you buy into the story that when this wine comes into its drinking window, the demand for the wine will be related to the fact that the label has a Chinese element? Would that still play a significant part in the premium, potentially the premium attached to this wine, right? So this is the sort of thing we need to think about. So this is a topic, speculation versus the Chinese market's impact on the world of wine investment and wine pricing is a topic that I have covered fairly extensively in my book. So if you're interested to read more, that's the page references for you to read about other stories and things that's been happening also in the auction market, for example, and what brought it about and what happened afterwards, and how is the market sort of rebalancing and correcting, and what's the outlook in the future. So all those things you can read later if you like. So when we talk about investing in wine, the first thing I would like to say is that speculation aside, because speculation, a lot of it is the desire to follow a bandwagon or to make a quick buck, right? Rather than fundamental interest or fundamental views of the asset. Whereas wine is often described as a passion asset. And I think that's important. It's an alternative asset, but more importantly, it's a passion asset, which means I think it's very important that you actually have a passion for wine and you want to know what you're investing in, right? Rather than just, giving some money to a fund or something. I think it always helps that you have some interest and understanding and some say in what exactly you're buying. I think that is important. At least for me, I think that's very important if you do want to invest in wine. This is the Coutts Private Bank's Passion Asset Index, and showing the returns of various asset classes, alternative passion asset returns. And you can see here wine has been doing quite well, and that's not surprising. Wine have always been shown to be a fairly good and robust performer, and it's not overall, it's not super volatile, and it does offer fairly good return over time. I personally find that comparing wine returns versus things like equity market or oil prices or gold prices is not always helpful, because it really depends on what period you're looking at. Because if you can look in the past history of relative performances of different asset classes, and you can always crop periods where one is outperforming the other, right, to suit your narrative. And also, just because wine was outperforming equity for a while does not necessarily imply that's the right thing to put your money in the future, right? Because as I was saying, interest rate environment might have fundamentally changed, between the 70s to the 2000s versus now, post 2016 to maybe quite a long time in the future. The interest rate environment is completely different. Therefore, that obviously has an implication on likely performances of the bond market and the equity market, right? So looking back at certain periods and cropping charts to look at relative performances, you kind of need to know why you're looking at those assets for those periods. Is that indicative of the future, right? And for many retail consumers, they might not really have that sort of nuanced understanding to be sold the story that wine is a great performer. It may be during certain periods, it may not be during certain periods. But overall, as I was saying earlier, I think looking ahead, into this sort of fairly chaotic world order and low interest rate, Brexit, etc., uncertainty. If we believe that the for quite a while yet, this is sort of the world order, the macroeconomic backdrop we are operating in, then, there's a strong case to be made for putting, or at least diversifying part of your wealth into physical assets such as wine, right? So I do think there is a good case from a macro perspective made for wine. And also from wine's own, the nature of wine is that the supply over time will diminish, whereas the demand, if we believe in the narrative that China will continue to grow in its interest in wine, and perhaps also Asia in general, or the wine market, the demand for wine is increasingly going to be a global demand versus a sort of limited supply to start with, and also diminishing supply over time of particular vintages, then there's a intrinsic case to be made for wine's supply and demand. This kind of intrinsic mismatch over time of supply and demand, which will boost price of wine over time as well. So I think with wine, investing in wine, two things are required, in my view. One is you have to be interested in it and definitely be involved in what you're buying, and having a clear reasoning behind why you're buying certain wines. And secondly, I think patience. Wine investing is not really for a quick buck, within 1 to 3 years. That doesn't really work. I mean, you can get lucky, but that is not really how you should look at investing in wine. Usually, we would talk about a medium term of 10 years, or a long term of at least sort of 20 years or so. So that's sort of the horizon. 10 plus years is the sort of investment horizon that we should be considering. So I just want to very quickly go through some quick important fundamentals of things to consider when you are investing in wine. So 投资, right? 投资, not 投机, right? So what should we consider? First of all, of course, is the producer, right? The producer, the brand, and the region. You want to know the reputation of the producer, the quality of the producer, of the brand. That the brand value and the desirability of the wine from the market, right? That's important. If you're just buying to drink, maybe you just need to know what you like. But when you're investing, you need to know what is the market perception of a brand value. How in demand a certain producer is or a certain region is. What's the terroir? Why is this region considered superior? Why are people more likely to pay a premium for this terroir, right? So that's also the sort of homework you need to do. And then, of course, production size, because that has a direct impact on the supply side, right? Similarly, with vintage, it's equally important to know the quality and the characteristics of a vintage. Sometimes a very hot vintage will produce wines which are very fruity and very expressive in the short term, but maybe the wine cannot last for 50 years, maybe, right? So the ageability, the aging potential of the wine may be, quite often is linked to the characteristics of the vintage, right? Again, with different vintages, you'll have different yield, right? So with a high yielding vintage, there will be more bottles produced. With a low yielding vintage, you have less bottles produced, therefore limited supply. So sometimes, for example, in Burgundy, 2016 is a really interesting example. So from a vintage perspective, it was almost, the weather was terrible at the beginning of the year, because there was a lot of hail, spring hail, that damaged a lot of the crops in Burgundy. But luckily, after that, the summer was very good. Therefore, a lot of the Burgundy producers were able to make very, very good wines, but in very small quantity. So you suddenly had this sort of very interesting situation where almost a natural disaster have actually yielded a year with high quality wine, but at very low quantity produced. Right, so that could be a year where, you will see it's already reflected in the prices that 2016 certain Burgundian wines will be trading at a significant premium to other vintages. Right, so all these reasons are important, and at play, and you have to make a judgment call in terms of whether that premium is justified, or actually that premium will only widen with time, right? Potentially, right? So all these are things to note in terms of supply and demand and the aging potential. And the other thing I want to mention is liquidity. So earlier we said, okay, look, DRC versus Lafitte, DRC is obviously very much more scarce than Lafitte. Therefore, the prices of DRC is much dearer. But in investment terms, that could be a double-edged sword because of liquidity issue. Because when you're investing, you obviously have a view that at some point you might want to sell some of the wines. And therefore, the market must have enough buyer and sellers, right? And therefore, arguably, why Bordeaux, despite all these recent volatilities, why Bordeaux is still considered very important in an investment portfolio is because Bordeaux wines tend to offer a good liquidity in the investment market versus Burgundy. The Burgundy, the plots, the producer, they can be tiny, right? Therefore, the wines may be very scarce, but they suffer from very poor liquidity and sometimes pricing transparency. And, where people want to sell versus where people want to buy could be at completely different prices. And when you want to sell your wine, you might find that you cannot find a buyer to buy it, etc. So liquidity is actually important. So it's not necessarily the case that the rarer, the more scarce is always better or more valuable, right? So in a market, you need buyers and you need sellers, you need prices that meet, right? So Bordeaux is still has that overwhelming advantage of being the most liquid, most sort of because of its larger and more consistent supply size of production, right? We mentioned credit scores later. So how do you do these type of research, right? So you can read credit scores and merchant reports and track primary and secondary market activities to get you familiarized with how people write about wine and what sort of things they consider, what sort of language they use, right? So that's the sort of thing you can start to get into. And then other aspects of investing, which are very important, is once you picked your wine, once you've decided what to go for, it's very important, especially in future years, to know the provenance of your wine, right? So this is where buying from reputable sources is very, very important, right? So many wines now would come with sort of a passport now from the moment it leaves the producer into a storage facility, such as a bonded warehouse, which means that it's tax-free while it remains in this type of warehouse. It will be registered. It will say this wine was produced at this chateau. It left the chateau. It was sold by this merchant, and it entered this facility on such date, right? So there's a track record of where the wine has been, and that's quite important. It proves the authenticity of the wine, and it shows the condition of the wine. Being moved only from the winery's cellar into a professional warehouse. And that is important. And quite often, that sort of wine would do well in auctions, right? Because a pristine record of provenance will carry a premium, especially if you're talking about fairly older wines or after a longer period of time, right? So storage is very important. You want to make sure that the wine is well stored, because when we talk about investment grade wine, these are wines that will need to be able to age well, right? So you are buying into the aging potential narrative, right? When it comes to wine, that's what it boils down to. There's no point investing in a wine that lasts for 2 years, right? That you buy in the supermarket, for example. You're talking about wines with great aging potential that can last 20, 50, 60, even more years, right? So the wine needs to be well stored. Consistency is very important in terms of temperature, humidity. You want low light environment, no noise pollution. You want to avoid vibration. So that's why a lot of the wines, even sometimes I would tell my friends who are based in China, if they don't need to move the wines, buy the wines, for example, in London or whatever, and just keep it here, keep it in the UK under bonded warehouse. If you're not drinking it in a hurry, or if your view is to sell some in the future, there's no need for it to travel, halfway across the world to China, to Hong Kong, for example. When potentially in the future, if you want to sell it again, you find your buyer is in the UK or in Europe, to ship it all across the world, halfway across the world back again. And too much traveling for wine is actually not good for it. And sometimes in auction prices, it will reflect that, wines that have not moved much would attract a premium sometimes, right? The other thing to consider is cost of carry, which is all the costs involved in storing the wine. If you're storing something for 10 years, you have to pay for storage, perhaps. And if you take the wine out of this type of tax-protected warehouse environment, then you have to consider paying excise duty, VAT tax. There might be delivery costs. So all these extra costs you need to factor in whether it's worthwhile buying a wine and holding it for X number of years versus just buying something that is ready to drink and you didn't have to bother with all these intermediate costs, right? So so basically there are quite a lot to think about around buying wine as well, and storing wine, and sort of all the logistics around investing in wine as well. And then, of course, it's important to at least understand, how you might be able to buy wine, how you might be able to sell wine. So buying wine, you can buy en primeur, which is buying a wine before it's even bottled, right? So it's a bit like, I suppose, an analogy would be buying off-plan property, right? Which a lot of Chinese people quite like to buy off-plan. And then when the property is built and ready to complete, sometimes the price have already gone up, for example. So that can be quite attractive. Or you can buy from reputable merchants on exchanges these days. Increasingly, there are more exchanges offering more direct interactions between buyers and sellers, and more transparent pricing and lower commissions. You can buy via auctions, but in all this, you need to understand the fees and commissions to see which option is better for particular wines, right? And then when it comes to selling, again, how do you sell, right? Because quite often holding a precious bottle of wine, it might have a book value, which is very, very high, but actually finding a buyer is a different story. So how do you sell? Through a merchant or through these exchanges or through auctions? Again, fees and commissions. And when we are talking about investing, as I was saying, you should really consider a fairly long time horizon, medium to long term, sort of 7 to 10 years, maybe as a medium horizon, and 10 plus year for a longer horizon. And that is tightly related to the drinking window of the wine you are buying. And the drinking window, of course, is a reflection of the aging potential of the wine, right? So when the wine comes into its drinking window, and sometimes that could be very long, that could be 10 plus years, right? That is when the wine generally achieves its greatest value. But of course, sometimes you might want to sell it before it's well into its drinking window, because people tend to prefer a wine that's not starting to deteriorate or about to come out of its drinking window, right? So when do you sell? Yeah, is the timing is also tied to this concept of the drinking window. And when you selecting the wines, the staples would be Bordeaux, as what I was saying. So back in 2010, for example, just to give you an idea, Bordeaux accounted for probably 95% of all the world's fine wine portfolios. Typically, a fine wine portfolio will be 95% Bordeaux, right, back in 2010. Whereas today, on average, a fine wine portfolio would have 50% in Bordeaux, and the rest are made up of Burgundies. But Burgundies, because of its tiny little supply, it's not really gonna ever rise too much, as a proportion, like Bordeaux can account for the world's sort of large portion of the world's fine wine portfolio demand. But Burgundy has gone up, but so has places like Italy, California, other parts of the world. They're all competing for a slice of the pie as well. So when you are picking your portfolio, there's certainly a case to be made to diversify, to pick some staples, like Bordeaux, but also to look at newcomers, some slightly beneath the radar areas. And that's where the concept of relative value. So relative value could be relative value between vintages, or between wineries, producers, or between wine regions, right, for example. So so all this is quite interesting. If you're interested in wine, all this is great fun. This is not awful, terrible work. It's actually very interesting and fun, and that's why I think having the passion to do this is important, right? For you to make the best sort of judgment call. So I think it's very interesting. If you are passionate and you want to learn about wine, that's the greatest premise for investing in wine. Just by learning and deciding, the entry point, the exit point, building a portfolio, and perhaps having some wines set aside for drinking. I think it's a bit boring if you just buy all these wines and then sell all of them again. It's a bit boring. Ideally, what you want is to have a portion that you can drink, right? As well. So usually, many people, many wine investors, invest in wine in order to fund their drinking pleasure, right? That's a very important aspect of investing wine, is so that you can afford to drink some of these great bottles. Because unfortunately, the reality is a lot of these investment grade wines these days are very, very expensive, are not accessible as our daily drinking wines anymore. So a cleverly built wine portfolio not only can give you some longer term returns, but will also fund your own drinking pleasure. Right, so that's kind of a more balanced view to wine investment, in my opinion. Right, so okay. So I guess the last question we should talk about is, what about Chinese wines, right? I've got a picture of Mars. It's like, is there life on Mars sort of question. Are Chinese wines worthy of investment? So here I want to just make one point, which is scarcity does not equate to investability, right? So in China, I'm sure many of you are aware, Chinese they love to create a buzz around the brand, and sometimes they'll say, "Oh, only X number are limited edition are produced, etc." So they deliberately make the product scarce to make the supply side seems to be very small in order to create this buzz around how the value should be justifiably higher. But in wine, really, the crucial question still remains, is this wine age-worthy, right? Because if a bottle of Chinese wine, only 10 bottles were made, let's just make a ridiculously extreme example, only 10 bottles are made, but it's only good for drinking the next 2 years. Well, quite frankly, there's no point investing in it. So the real question is, are Chinese wines age-worthy? And the real answer to that, the truthful answer to that is it's still too early to tell, right? So I think experts, this is sort of beyond my level of expertise, but people, Chinese winery owners and consultants and international wine experts are starting to say that there are certain areas in China that could have great aging potentials for wine, right? So that is the real question. And it's too early, and especially it's not for me to call. But there are certain regions, such as potentially Yunnan, right? Yunnan province. Possibly the wines of Yunnan could be rather age-worthy. Maybe we can't say on the level of Bordeaux, but certainly there's great opportunities for vines to age, for older vines to develop, and therefore making more complex, interesting wines that have good aging potential. And there are similarly other areas in China that could have aging potential in the future. But the short answer is it's probably too early to tell. Okay. Right. So I'm going to stop there for tonight. And next time, it's in 2 weeks' time, 7th of February, we're going to do a Chinese New Year special. So it's the week before Chinese New Year. So leading up to the week of Chinese New Year, we're going to look at famous Chinese cuisines and wine as a New Year topic. Incidentally, on the morning of the 7th of February, I will be on Channel 4's Sunday Brunch program doing a similar topic, which is Chinese wine, actually, I'm not going to divulge too much. It will be wines to go with your Chinese feast. And two of the wines in our current mixed case will be featured on the show. So 2 out of these 6 bottles I will also show on the Sunday Brunch show. So if you have time, do tune in on Channel 4 around 11:50. It's usually just before noon. It's a live TV. It's live TV from my home during COVID lockdown. But if you are free to join me in the morning as well as later on in the evening for our Note of Mandarin session, I hope to maybe see you twice on Sunday, 7th of February. All right. And if you're interested in getting this mixed case, it is a very good case. I'm very happy with this case. So they're all single varietal wines. So the idea is to show you some specific grapes in its Chinese or English terroir, right? So 3 whites, 3 reds, 2 whites from China, 1 white from England, and similarly 2 reds from China and 1 red from England, right? So if you want to get this case, it's available through the Cambridge China Center website. Okay, so I will return to Jingzhao, and we can have a chat about the wine. if you're drinking any wine or this particular wine, Martin Cabernet Grenache, or if you want to chat about investment, wine investment, we can open up the floor. Oh yeah, and pub quiz. Does anyone know what these two characters actually say? Any ideas? Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we can start chatting.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you. That's a very interesting topic. Hilarious stories too. So everybody's audio and video has been activated. So please feel free to join us, carry on drinking and chatting. So somebody in the chat. Oh, I think we have a few saying in the chat box trying to answer that pop quiz. It's right.
Yeah, so when I first got asked this question, I was like, oh my God, I feel terribly embarrassed because I don't recognize either of these characters. Maybe my level of Chinese is slightly not up to scratch. But yes, so if you stare at it very carefully.
Again.
Yeah, let me share it again. It actually says Mouton Rothschild, but it just looks like Chinese. So if you see it, that's M. Can you see my cursor? MOUTON, and this is ROTHSCHILD. So it's actually spelling out Mouton Rothschild, but just in a style that looks like Chinese calligraphy. So that's what that is. And yeah, so let me get back to our
well done, Helen, and well done.
Yeah, well done. DJ and Helen both got that, and Wei Ming. Excellent. Great.
Very good.
Very good. Okay, cool. So right, let me have a sip to moisten my throat. So, anyone drinking this Cabernet Grenache tonight?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
No, I think it's good. I think it will last for a few more years yet. Really, I think it's still quite young. It's still quite open calorie. So 3-5 years at least will go on.
Yeah, I agree. It's very it's got a lovely fruity character, but you can tell.
Yeah.
With the acidity, the structure, it will still sort of integrate and develop a bit more over the next week.
Very good wine. Interesting about the bottle though, because I couldn't find the vintage on the bottle anywhere.
Yeah. No, it's true. Because interestingly, in China, the concept of vintage is not very important yet to consumers. And actually, some wineries deliberately don't put vintage on because they don't want people to have an impression that the wine is too old or about to be out of date. Or, if you see like 2015, you might say, oh, is this wine too old? So vintage, the concept of vintage, is still a quite young one. Yeah. So no, well spotted. And that is the reason. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a special guest in the audience, William.
Oh wow, William Lowe.
Actually, I'm not sure what William.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, thank you.
Session. And a brief background: William is the only double master in the whole world so far.
Wow.
Well, master of wine and
master of wine and master distiller.
Yeah.
So, and also William is the founder and CEO of Cambridge Distillery, and they do wonderful gin. Cambridge gin. So if when the restrictions are lifted up, coming to Cambridge, we can do some tasting, try some Cambridge gin as well. Thank you.
Right. I see Bob. Hello, Bob.
I've got a question.
Happy New Year. Yes, I've got a cup of tea here at the moment, but not tomorrow. I'm not sure it's Chinese tea or not, but I'm just wondering. So, what do the empty bottles sell for? There must be a secondary market in genuine empty bottles, particularly.
You're so.
A series of paintings which they've done in 30 years or so. They started doing these specially commissioned paintings. So
that's an interesting question. Yeah. I'm sure there's a secondary market, but you know what's interesting? In recent years, more and more, I've noticed if I go drink at vineyards, etc., sometimes when you take away, especially if it's a famous vineyard, and if you take away the bottle, they would actually mark it across the label, to avoid it being ended up in the hands of counterfeiters. So it's a double-edged sword, with the popularity and demand of fine wines. They are having to be more careful. But the artwork, it's I'm sure there's a secondary market, maybe worth looking into. Can't afford the wine, but maybe can afford the empty bottle.
might be a little bit of scent just left in the bottle that you could sniff occasionally.
Yes, exactly. A little bit of sediment.
Well, maybe a market in the corks as well, of course.
Yes, exactly. Corks, labels, bottles, they are all becoming quite heavily guarded items.
Well, yes. Yes, as you say, they'd be worth more if you just filled them up with something and resold them. So
yeah, absolutely.
Avoid that.
Cool.
And how do you think the investment will carry on after this pandemic? Will it carry on as well, or probably even better? Because
actually, if you look at the charts, the performance of wine was very strong during the pandemic, and it looks set to keep on growing. Yeah, I think that trend, I personally think I'm quite bullish about this trend. Because I think, for several reasons. A is the interest rate, and the macro backdrop is difficult, and wine tend to do fairly well as a physical asset, during times of sort of uncertainty, and when people want to put money into alternative assets, that's when wine tend to do quite well. But it also doesn't have that ridiculously volatile nature as well. This is obviously relatively speaking to other assets, right? I mean, yes, arguably Bitcoin was probably a better bet, but it's a bit, it's a bit too volatile for a lot of people's liking as well. So, so both in terms of risk profile, volatility, and its intrinsic supply demand, this divergence, that intrinsic value for wine should also support it at the fundamental level. So anyway, so I think we'll probably enter into a fairly long period where interest rate will be very low. So that should bode quite well for the fine wine market in general. Hello, Duncan. Hi.
Hello. Yes, I would agree with you. The other thing to say about the current environment is that with Western governments drowning in debt, there's no real prospect that interest rates are going to go up anytime in the next few years. So if interest rates remain low, then alternative assets, or as you say, passion assets, cars, paintings, will continue to go up. I suppose that there has to be some break on things like Romani Conte, but maybe the interesting speculation will be whether there's some of the other areas of the world where they do make very good wine in relatively scarce quantities will become more investable. So whether some wines in California, Australia would start to attract more speculative interest, particularly for the big new incremental buyer in the market, which, as you've outlined, is the Chinese investor or the Chinese drinker.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. Wow, I totally agree with Duncan because he's the head of Morgan Stanley equity research. So I think whatever you say
Yes,
is going to be.
I think I've been oversold already.
Anyway, yes. So thank you for your your.
I suppose the other thing you can say about wine is that well, I mean, like cars, you can drive your mistakes and you can drink your mistakes, but you just have to lick your wounds with buying the wrong shares.
Exactly. Yeah. Or Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So I'm getting some comments in the chat box about the wine, which is great. Yeah. It's good that for those of you who are drinking this, this wine seems to be going down very well. That's always good.
We had the white from the same winery for the first meeting.
Yeah, so we showed the Martin Vineyard Longyan, right? Because I wanted to show a very special Chinese variety. So I am a fan of Martin Winery because they are they are quite brave to embrace these sort of niche varieties, I suppose, because as you know, China, the overwhelming planted variety is Cabernet Sauvignon. So for this boutique winery to specialize in things like Longyan and Cabernet Grenache, it's quite bold. And the fact that they're making such wonderful wines out of these grapes, it's even better. So I am a great fan and supporter, I suppose, of Martin Winery. Yeah.
Varieties. So.
Yeah. So someone's asking, how about Italian wines as investment? And that's a really good question. And in fact, in recent years, Italy has been the sort of a darling newcomer in the world of wine investment. So areas like Super Tuscans, I'm sure you've probably heard of, have done very, very well. And also the latest terribly kept secret is like Piedmont, and Barolos have done well as well. So yeah, Italy is definitely a hot picking spots for wine investment. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you for the interesting, wonderful talk on speculation and investment, and also a very good recommendation of a
good
wine. Looks like it's well received.
I'm glad it's showing well, and people.
And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on the first session of session 2, a Nota Mandarin Wine Club. In 2 weeks' time, on the 7th of February, we will talk about the famous Chinese cuisines and wine matching, because it's going to be Chinese New Year soon. Chinese New Year's Day will be on the 12th of February. So we look forward to another special session. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Dr. Lu.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Lu. Thank you, Giselle.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Good night. See you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay.